Recently, I reached out on Instagram for you guys to ask me a question, and I have saved all of my favorite ones right here, and today I'm going to be answering them. If you do like this style of video, make sure you hit the like button because this is actually my first Q&A. So without further ado, let's jump in with the first question. Paul asks, what's a cheap lens for portraits? Definitely the cheapest and arguably the best focal length is the 50mm. A lot of camera manufacturers make their own versions of this lens, and it's usually an f1.8. For APS-C, that would be a 33 or a 35mm. For the FujiFilm system, I think they have an f2 version. And these lenses are pretty cheap, but usually the autofocus is decent and it's sharp enough in the center. And this brings us on to our next question, which is, what's your favorite lens for portraits and why? If I could only own the one lens for portrait photography, it would actually be the 50mm. That's just due to the fact that the 50mm is very close to what our eyes see in terms of compression and field of view. So you do get a much natural looking portrait without all that different distortion like you get on wider focal lengths and also tighter focal lengths like an 85 or a 135. Now I'm always undecided between 35 and 50, and using the Fujifilm X-T5, my favorite lens is a 27mm f1.2 from Viltrox. Now that actually gives you the 40mm full frame field of view, which I just think is fantastic for portraits as it gives you the best of both worlds. And I really do wish that other full frame camera manufacturers like Sony and Canon and Nikon made faster and better 40mm f1.4 or even f1.2 prime lenses. All right, on to the next question. And for portrait work, do you ever choose a focal length based on the features of the model? I definitely do. If the model is a little bit shorter, I tend to use wider focal lengths for full body shots like a 24 or 35. And then also vice versa, if the model is quite tall and I want to shrink them down a little bit, I'll shoot on a 50 or even an 85mm. Also with wider focal lengths, you can make people have more interesting facial expressions with a wider lens at closer distances. And then for my wedding work, I definitely stick to the rules. So I use 24mm for a wide establishing shot. I'll use 35mm for a more close-up full body portrait. And then for mid shots and detail shots, I'll be using a 50mm just to get those natural and true to life facial features from that non-distorted 50mm. Next question from Jonathan. Do you expose for highlights, especially while shooting on the beach? For a landscape or lifestyle image, I generally shoot all of my images with a neutral exposure. So all of the highlights, the midtones and the shadows will look more natural. So definitely make sure that I'm not clipping the highlights, and I'd rather crush my blacks and my shadows than clip the highlights in that scenario. For portrait photography, I'm always exposing for the skin. So if I'm backlighting a subject, I'll completely just blow out the highlights. It almost gives you as if you're shooting against a backdrop. And I will give you the tip that if you shoot on longer focal lengths like an 85mm, you can really compress and cut that light in a little bit more, and then the background won't seem so bright and blown out. For my exposure, I really do expose just like I'm shooting on film. So on film, you really do not get a lot of latitude in the shadows. So you really have to pick what you expose for. And for portraits, I'm always exposing for the midtones, which is the skin. Next question is manual or auto white balance? 99% of the time I'm shooting in auto white balance, and I've made a few tips on shooting on other camera brands like Canon or Fuji just to change that tint and that warmth a little bit more, because I feel their auto white balance isn't as good as Sony. Sony really do give you a good base to edit from, and I'm always shooting in RAW so I can just change this later, but having a good auto white balance does make editing a lot easier and a lot faster. The only instance that I'd shoot in manual white balance is of course for videos, so I've set my white balance here. And if I was ever doing some e-commerce, typically you only give away the JPEG images. So with that, you have to set a custom white balance with your flash, and then you don't edit any of the images, they just get sent off as JPEGs. And I used to actually be a school photographer, so I used to take photos of kids for their yearbooks, and we'd only give away JPEG images, and then we'd have to set a custom white balance with the flash and just not change it throughout the day and just upload the JPEG image. All right, next question. Do you plan to do a video on how I edit my photos? So in about 2 weeks, I'm going to be posting a video on my complete editing workflow for a recent portrait shoot that I did. So that's going to show you guys how I cull, import all of my photos into Lightroom, and then also how I retouch my photos and export them. So if you want to see that video, make sure you subscribe. All right, next question is, how do you pose people in a portrait shoot that are not models? Love your presets, by the way. Well, I'm glad you guys like my presets, and if you do like the way that I edit my photos, of course I do sell Lightroom presets, which are linked in the description down below. So when you start portrait photography, it's kind of ironic as you're a beginner photographer and you're usually shooting beginner models. And even as an experienced photographer, I do find myself shooting inexperienced models. So I will say that the best thing to do, especially when you are a beginner photographer, is just having your mood board always handy and having those poses and those different angles that you want to get. This is great as the model can clearly see the idea and what type of pose that she has to do, because again, they're not very experienced. And also it's great for you because you get an idea of the lighting that you want to do, the composition, what focal length you want to shoot on, etc, etc. If you guys have been watching the channel for a long time, you'll know that I am a wedding photographer that shoots around 60 to 80 weddings a year. And my most asked question is, Jerry, we're not models and we're not comfortable in front of the camera. So all these wedding couples that I shoot are definitely not models, and I just guide them throughout the day with walking shots, a little bit of movement. I have my go-to poses. For men especially, definitely have something to do with their hands. They have to be rubbing them together, they have to be fixing their jacket, otherwise their hands just standing there like awkwardly. So that's definitely a good tip for guys. And yeah, lastly is just to show confidence in the photos. Even if you don't think the photos are amazing, just let the model know that, hey, these are great, everything's looking good. And that really does just boost the morale and also her confidence of the whole shoot. And then at the end of the shoot, that's where you get your best photos, when everyone's comfortable, the photographer, the model, and who else is collaborating in the project. All right, next question from Paul is, what is your opinion about study photography or self-learning? So one of the main things that I wish I did was not being so stingy or tight to buying an online course in photography. I spent about a year just watching YouTube videos, which did actually chew up a lot of time to learn all the basics about photography, where in realistic terms, I probably could have learned most of this over about a month or two. But then once you've learned the basics, the next step is to get a lot of experience, and the only way to do that is to take your camera and shoot everything. So try all of the different genres of photography, lifestyle, street photography, landscape, portraiture. Even if you don't have an interest in it, you do actually learn a lot. So while I don't think it's a good idea to go out and do a 4-year degree at university to become a photographer, because in that 4 years time, you could actually build a whole business around photography and making a very substantial earnings, where if you just come out of uni after 4 years, you're broke, you have a student loan, and you don't have an income. So definitely learn the basics online and all the theories, and then go out and practice and perfect your craft. All right, on to the last question of the day. Which of your camera systems has the most reliable focus and sharpness? Hands down, this has to be Sony. Now, I have used Canon here on the channel before, and obviously I do own FujiFilm. My Sony cameras very rarely do miss focus, and all of the photos are always really sharp, like really detailed, compared to the Fuji files, which I've never really had a nice sharp image from my X-T5. And that also comes down to the glass that I use. So I'm always just using the Sigma prime lenses and a few zooms. And these new Sigma DG DN lenses are just ridiculously sharp. The autofocus is fantastic. And also just the files coming out of my Sony a7 IV with that 33 megapixel sensor. And then lastly, I do actually have quite a bit of experience shooting on Canon. My main gripe with Canon is that they do have fantastic autofocus that's probably just a little bit better than Sony, but it also comes down to the lens options that I've tried. So they do have some great RF zooms that are pretty sharp, they're pretty good performance, but then they're really let down in their f1.4 primes because majority of the time you have to adapt a EF lens, and those older EF lenses, especially from Sigma, just aren't amazing. Alright guys, that was a pretty fun video to make. Looking forward to editing this one. If you do like this style of video, please hit that like button, as I will make more videos like this in the future. If you do like the way that I edited any of these photos that I showed in today's video, go check out my Lightroom presets. And finally, this is actually my last video filming in this space. So I'm about to move out, my partner's about to move in, and I'm actually about to move into my own photography studio, which is super exciting. So yeah, stay tuned, stay engaged, and I'm going to go enjoy my day, and we'll see you later.